My parents' golden son got it all: Ivy League education, a brand new BMW at 17, and Dad's company card by 21. But at a family barbecue, when he heard me casually mention my third house, he lost it. He flung his drink, and Mom burst into tears, and then Grandpa chuckled and said something that instantly silenced everyone. Can you imagine standing in your own backyard at a family barbecue when your golden child brother, the one who always got everything, suddenly throws a beer bottle at your face? What if that single moment, that shocking act of rage, ripped open 2 decades of carefully constructed lies, exposing not just his darkest secrets, but the devastating betrayals of your own parents? It was supposed to be a peaceful family barbecue, a warm Sunday in my childhood backyard. My golden child brother, Marcus, was holding court as usual. But then I casually mentioned buying my third rental property, and it was like I'd struck a nerve. The air shifted. The next thing I knew, his beer bottle was flying directly at my face. Our mother, Sharon, burst into hysterical tears. Our father, Robert, froze completely, his burger halfway to his mouth. The entire extended family stared in absolute stunned silence. The amber glass shattered against the wooden fence behind me, beer foam dripping down the pickets like accusatory tears. And then, our 82-year-old grandfather, Walter, started laughing. A deep, knowing chuckle that cut through the chaos like a blade. He slowly stood up from his lawn chair, looked directly at Marcus with eyes that had seen 8 decades of family secrets, and said something that would shatter 28 years of carefully constructed family dynamics forever. Growing up in the Patterson household meant understanding one fundamental, unshakable rule: Marcus came first, always. I learned this lesson hard at age 18. His Harvard acceptance letter arrived on the same day as my community college acceptance. The house erupted in celebration for Marcus. Mom immediately called every relative within a 50-mile radius to announce that her precious son would be attending the most prestigious university in America. Dad opened a bottle of champagne that had been sitting in our basement since his wedding day, saving it for what he called a truly special occasion. Meanwhile, my envelope sat unopened on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Nobody asked about my plans or offered congratulations. I was background noise in the symphony of Marcus' achievements. The pattern continued relentlessly. When Marcus turned 17, Dad surprised him with a brand new BMW 3 Series sedan, complete with leather interior and a premium sound system. The metallic silver paint gleamed in our driveway like a trophy. Marcus acted like he deserved it, casually mentioning to his friends that it was just a starter car until I graduate college. Me? I had been working 2 part-time jobs since I was 16, one at Target and another at a local restaurant, saving every single dollar to buy my own transportation. 6 months later, I finally scraped together enough money for a 10-year-old Honda Civic with 130,000 miles on the odometer. The air conditioning didn't work, and the radio only picked up AM stations, but it was mine. I had earned every payment, every squeak and rattle. When Marcus graduated from Harvard with a business degree, Dad handed him the keys to a corner office at Patterson Construction Company, along with embossed business cards that read, Marcus Patterson, Vice President of Operations. He was 21 years old and had never swung a hammer or read a blueprint in his life. Dad justified it by claiming Marcus needed executive experience to eventually take over the family business. The nepotism was so blatant that even some of Dad's longtime employees started grumbling about fairness and qualifications. During those same years, I was grinding through business school at night while working full-time during the day. I had transferred my community college credits to Rutgers and was completing my bachelor's degree in finance 1 class at a time. My day started at 6 o'clock in the morning, working as an administrative assistant at a small accounting firm, and my evenings were spent in lecture halls learning about market analysis and investment strategies. I graduated with honors and, more importantly, with no student debt, having paid for every credit hour myself. While Marcus was being groomed to inherit a construction empire, I was quietly building something of my own. I had been studying real estate markets for months, analyzing neighborhood trends and property values throughout central New Jersey. At 25, I purchased my first rental property, a modest three-bedroom colonial in Hamilton Township that needed cosmetic updates but had excellent bones. I spent weekends painting walls, replacing fixtures, and learning basic plumbing from YouTube videos. Within 6 months, I had reliable tenants paying enough rent to cover the mortgage with $400 left over each month. 2 years later, I bought my second property, using the equity from the first as a down payment. This one was a duplex in Lawrenceville that generated even better cash flow. I was reinvesting every profit, living modestly in a small apartment while building a portfolio that would eventually provide true financial independence. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus, despite his Ivy League education and executive position, was still living in my parents' guest bedroom at 28 years old. He drove his BMW to work every morning, wore expensive suits that Mom bought for him, and spent his evenings playing video games or going out to expensive restaurants that Dad's credit card funded. This brings us to last Sunday's family barbecue, an annual tradition where our extended family gathered to celebrate the end of summer. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents filled our backyard, the same space where Marcus and I had played as children. Grandfather Walter was holding court near the grill, sharing stories from his 40 years as a general contractor before Dad took over the business operations. I was having a casual conversation with my cousin Jenny about career changes when she mentioned wanting to get into real estate investing. Actually, I said, keeping my voice low and conversational. I just closed on my third property last week. It's a small apartment building in Princeton Junction with 4 units. The numbers look really promising for long-term appreciation. The words were barely out of my mouth when I noticed Marcus had stopped his conversation mid-sentence. His face went completely red, the kind of angry flush that I remembered from childhood tantrums when he didn't get his way immediately. He stalked over to where Jenny and I were standing, his beer bottle clenched so tightly in his fist that his knuckles had turned white. "Third property," he snarled, loud enough that nearby conversations began to quiet. "Are you seriously standing here lying to people about being some kind of real estate mogul? You work as a secretary and live in that pathetic studio apartment downtown." The accusations stung. Not because they were true, but because they revealed how little my own brother knew about my life. He'd been so wrapped up in his own privilege that he had never bothered asking what I actually did for work or how I spent my time. I'd been promoted to senior financial analyst at my firm 2 years earlier, and I had moved from the studio apartment 18 months ago. "Marcus, I'm not lying about anything," I replied calmly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I've been investing in rental property since I was 25. It started small, but bullshit," he exploded. And that's when he hurled his beer bottle with full force. I ducked instinctively, feeling the breeze as the bottle whizzed past my head and exploded against the fence. Beer and glass fragments scattered across the patio, and our golden retriever Max bolted for the house. The entire backyard fell silent, except for Mom's immediate sobbing. She covered her face with her hands, rocking back and forth in her folding chair like she was witnessing a natural disaster. Dad stood frozen, his burger still suspended in midair, his mouth hanging open in shock. Uncle Pete sat down his drink and stepped protectively closer to his wife and children. That's when Grandfather Walter's laughter cut through the tension. It started as a low chuckle, then built into a full-bodied laugh that seemed to find genuine humor in the chaos. He rose slowly from his lawn chair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests for support, and fixed Marcus with a stare that could have melted steel. "Boy," he said in a voice that carried the authority of 8 decades. "You just threw a tantrum about your sister's success while you've been stealing from the family business for 3 years." The words hit the gathering like a physical blow. Marcus went pale. Dad dropped his burger completely, and Mom's crying stopped so abruptly it was like someone had flipped a switch. Grandfather Walter reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded envelope thick with papers. "I've been the silent partner in Patterson Construction for 40 years, and I've been watching the books very carefully lately. Marcus, you've been embezzling company funds, $87,000 in forged invoices, padded expense reports, and skimmed cash from off-the-books jobs. I have bank statements, canceled checks, and documentation of every fraudulent transaction." The accusation landed like a bomb in our peaceful suburban backyard, and I realized that my casual mention of a real estate investment had just triggered the exposure of a crime that would destroy my family's foundation forever. The silence that followed Grandfather Walter's revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 seconds. Uncle Pete broke it by quietly ushering his wife, Linda, and their 2 teenage daughters toward the house, murmuring something about getting more ice from the kitchen. Other family members began finding excuses to step away from the immediate blast zone. Though nobody actually left the property, this was the kind of family drama that people would be discussing for years to come. Marcus stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions like a broken slot machine: shock, denial, rage, fear, then back to shock again. His mouth opened and closed several times before any words emerged. "That's absolutely ridiculous," he finally stammered, but his voice cracked on the word absolutely. "I would never steal from Dad's company. This is insane. Grandpa, you're 82 years old. Maybe you're confused about some paperwork or..." Confused? Walter's voice carried a sharp edge that I had never heard before. He opened the envelope and spread several documents across the picnic table, weighing them down with salt and pepper shakers to prevent them from blowing away. "These bank statements show cash deposits to your personal account that don't match any legitimate payroll or bonus payments. This invoice here is for lumber delivery to a construction site that we completed 6 months before the date on the paperwork. And this expense report claims you purchased $8,000 worth of power tools that never appeared in our inventory." Dad finally found his voice, stepping closer to examine the papers Walter had arranged on the table. His face grew progressively paler as he reviewed each document. "Marcus, what is this? These invoices have my signature, but I don't remember authorizing these purchases." "Because you didn't authorize them," Walter said grimly. "He's been using the signature stamp from your office desk. I noticed discrepancies in the quarterly reports about 6 months ago and started doing my own investigation." Mom had stopped crying but looked like she might collapse. She gripped the arms of her lawn chair so tightly that I worried she might tip over backward. "There has to be an explanation," she whispered. "Marcus wouldn't steal from family. He's going through a difficult time with work stress, but he wouldn't." "What work stress?" I found myself asking before I could stop the words. "He shows up to the office at 10 o'clock in the morning, takes 2-hour lunches, and leaves by 4 o'clock. Half the time he's playing games on his computer instead of reviewing contracts." Marcus whirled around to face me, his eyes blazing with fury. "How would you know anything about my work schedule? You don't work in the construction industry. You don't understand the pressure of running major projects and managing client relationships." "I drive past the office building every morning at 8:30 on my way to work," I replied calmly. "Your BMW is never in the parking lot before 10 o'clock. And Jenny's husband, Rick, works as an electrician on several of your projects. He's mentioned that you rarely show up at job sites, and when you do, you spend most of the time on personal phone calls." The additional details seemed to deflate Marcus's indignation. Dad looked at him with an expression I had never seen before, disappointment mixed with genuine confusion, as if he was seeing his son clearly for the first time. "Marcus," Dad said quietly, his voice heavy, "I need you to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. Did you steal money from our company?" Instead of answering directly, Marcus launched into a desperate deflection strategy. "This is all coming from her," he said, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "She's been jealous of my success since we were kids. She probably manipulated Grandpa into believing these lies so she could destroy my reputation and take my place in the company." The accusation was so absurd that I actually laughed out loud. "Take your place in the company, Marcus? I have a career in financial analysis. I've never expressed any interest in construction management. And I definitely didn't manipulate an 82-year-old man into fabricating bank records and forged invoices." Walter stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had built a business from nothing and run it successfully for 4 decades. "Nobody manipulated me into anything. I've been tracking these irregularities for months using the same forensic accounting methods I learned when the IRS audited us back in 1995. Every piece of evidence is documented, cross-referenced, and verified." Dad sat down heavily at the picnic table and began examining the paperwork more thoroughly. The burger he had dropped was attracting flies, but nobody seemed to notice. After several minutes of silent review, he looked up at Marcus with tears in his eyes. These signatures look exactly like mine, but I remember specifically choosing not to approve this lumber order because we had excess inventory from the previous job. And these tool purchases. Marcus, I asked you to research new equipment suppliers, but I told you not to place any orders without running the final costs past me first. The foundation of Marcus' defense was crumbling. But instead of admitting guilt or showing remorse, he doubled down on his anger. Fine. Maybe I made some executive decisions without getting approval first. Maybe I streamlined some purchasing processes to improve efficiency, but calling it stealing is completely unfair. I was trying to help the business grow. Help the business grow by depositing company checks into your personal bank account? Walter's question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus stormed toward the house, then spun around for a final outburst. This family has never appreciated anything I've contributed. I graduated from Harvard. I brought sophisticated business practices to a small-town construction company. I've been working to modernize operations and improve profitability. And this is the thanks I get? You're all going to regret treating me like a criminal. He disappeared into the house, leaving the rest of us staring at each other across a backyard littered with broken glass and shattered assumptions. Mom was crying again, but quietly this time, like someone grieving a death. Dad looked like he had aged 5 years in the past hour. The remaining family members began returning to the immediate area, drawn by curiosity and the sense that the crisis had reached some kind of temporary plateau. Aunt Carol approached Mom and rubbed her shoulders while Uncle Pete started cleaning up the broken beer bottle with a small hand broom he had found in the garage. I felt oddly detached from the chaos, like I was watching someone else's family fall apart. The real estate investment that had started this entire confrontation suddenly seemed trivial compared to the magnitude of what had been revealed. My brother had been systematically stealing from our father's business while living a lifestyle funded by fraud and family generosity. 3 days passed before Marcus emerged from his self-imposed isolation. During that time, Dad spent hours at the office reviewing financial records with Walter and their longtime accountant, Patricia Holloway. The full scope of the theft became clearer with each review session. Marcus had been remarkably systematic and sophisticated in his approach to embezzlement. On Wednesday evening, Marcus called a family meeting. He asked everyone to gather at my parents' house at 7 o'clock, claiming he had important information that would clarify the misunderstandings from Sunday. His tone on the phone was confident, almost arrogant, which seemed strange given the evidence that had been presented against him. I arrived to find Marcus sitting at the dining room table with a black leather briefcase positioned in front of him like a shield. He was wearing one of his expensive suits and had styled his hair perfectly, as if he were preparing for a business presentation rather than addressing accusations of criminal behavior. I appreciate everyone taking time from their schedules, he began, his voice carrying the polished tone he used with construction clients. I've spent the past 3 days conducting my own investigation into the financial irregularities grandfather Walter discovered, and I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than any of us initially realized. He opened the briefcase with theatrical precision and began removing documents organized in clear plastic sleeves. The presentation felt rehearsed, like he had practiced this moment multiple times in front of a mirror. After reviewing company records and cross-referencing expense reports with project timelines, I've discovered that the theft Walter identified is real. However, he paused dramatically, allowing his words to sink in before delivering what he clearly considered a devastating revelation. He identified the wrong perpetrator. The person who has been embezzling from Patterson Construction is Audra. The accusation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I felt my breathing become shallow and my vision narrow as Marcus began spreading out documents that supposedly proved my guilt. The papers looked official: company letterhead, what appeared to be Dad's signature, detailed expense reports with my name highlighted in yellow marker. These invoices show payments to Audra's landscaping company for work performed at various construction sites over the past 2 years. The problem is, she never registered a landscaping company with the state, never performed any work for us, and the bank account receiving these payments belongs to her personally. He was lying. Every word was a carefully constructed falsehood designed to shift blame away from himself and onto me. But the documents looked convincing, and I could see doubt beginning to creep into my parents' expressions. Marcus had spent 3 days not reflecting on his crimes or preparing to make amends. He had spent 72 hours creating an elaborate frame-up designed to destroy my reputation and potentially send me to prison for his theft. The aftermath of Marcus' counteraccusation felt like being trapped in a nightmare where reality kept shifting beneath my feet. I stared at the forged documents spread across my parents' dining room table, each one more sophisticated than the last. He had created fake email exchanges between myself and Dad discussing landscaping projects that never existed. He had produced bank statements showing deposits from Patterson Construction to an account that supposedly belonged to my fictitious landscaping business. Most damaging of all, he had crafted expense reports with meticulous detail, including photographs of completed landscaping work at construction sites I had never visited. "This is impossible," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "I've never owned a landscaping company. I don't know anything about commercial landscaping. These documents are fake." Marcus leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression, like a chess player who had just announced checkmate. "I understand this is difficult to accept, but the evidence is overwhelming. I think you started small, maybe just padding a few expense reports, and then it escalated when you realized how easy it was to manipulate Dad's trust." Dad picked up one of the fake invoices, studying it with the same careful attention he gave to construction blueprints. The letterhead looked authentic, complete with our company logo and contact information. The descriptions of landscaping work were detailed and professional, including specific plant varieties and soil preparation techniques that sounded legitimate to someone without expertise in that field. "Audra," Dad said slowly, "can you explain why your name appears on these invoices and why money was transferred to a bank account linked to your social security number?" The question revealed how thoroughly Marcus had prepared his deception. He hadn't just created fake paperwork. He had somehow accessed my personal information to make the financial trail appear authentic. I felt a growing sense of panic as I realized how difficult it would be to disprove accusations that had been constructed with this level of detail and sophistication. "I need to hire an attorney," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "And I want a forensic accountant to examine every one of these documents. If Marcus is claiming I stole from the company, then we need a professional investigation to determine the truth." Mom looked back and forth between Marcus and me like she was watching a tennis match, her face reflecting the agony of a mother being forced to choose which child to believe. "Why would either of you steal from family?" she whispered. "How did we get to this point?" The following morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching forensic accounting firms in New Jersey. I needed someone with experience in financial fraud cases, preferably someone who had worked on embezzlement investigations. After 3 hours of phone calls and online research, I found Lisa Chin at Integrity Financial Services. Her credentials included a CPA certification, a master's degree in forensic accounting, and 15 years of experience working with both prosecution and defense attorneys on white-collar crime cases. Lisa agreed to meet with me that afternoon. Her office was located in a modern building in Princeton, and she projected the kind of quiet confidence that made me feel cautiously optimistic for the first time in days. She listened carefully as I explained the situation, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions about timelines and relationships. "Your brother's documentation looks professional at first glance," she said after reviewing the papers Marcus had presented, "but there are several red flags that suggest forgery. The font used in these invoices doesn't match the standard formatting that most businesses used 2 years ago. Also, the metadata on these digital documents will tell us exactly when they were created and what software was used." While Lisa began her technical analysis, I reached out to grandfather Walter for moral support. He had remained convinced of my innocence throughout Marcus' presentation, which meant everything to me during this period of family chaos. We met for coffee at a small diner near his retirement community, and he brought additional evidence he had been collecting. I've been building this case for months, Walter explained, spreading out bank statements and canceled checks across the small Formica table. Marcus got sloppy about 6 months ago. He started making larger withdrawals and forging signatures on checks that required dual authorization. I think his gambling habit escalated, and he needed more money faster. This was the first time anyone had mentioned gambling. Walter explained that he had been quietly investigating Marcus' personal finances and discovered regular trips to Atlantic City, large cash advances on credit cards, and suspicious financial transactions that suggested someone with a serious addiction. How long have you known about the gambling? I started suspecting something last Christmas when he asked me for a personal loan of $15,000. He claimed it was for investment opportunities, but he was evasive about the details and seemed desperate for cash quickly. I didn't give him the money, but I started paying closer attention to his behavior. Walter's investigation had revealed a pattern of escalating financial desperation. Marcus had maxed out 3 credit cards, taking cash advances against his BMW loan, and even borrowed money from several of his Harvard classmates. The pressure to maintain his lifestyle while feeding a gambling addiction had apparently driven him to embezzlement as a solution. 2 days later, Lisa called with preliminary results from her forensic analysis. The news was even worse than I had expected. Your brother's frame-up was extraordinarily sophisticated, she reported. He used professional-grade software to create these fake documents, and he's been planning this deception for approximately 5 months. The metadata shows he's been creating false financial records and email trails, systematically building toward this moment when he would need a scapegoat for his theft. Lisa had discovered that Marcus had been accessing my personal information through family documents stored at my parents' house. He had used my social security number to create a fictitious business entity and had been monitoring my actual bank accounts to make his false financial trail appear more convincing. Most disturbing of all, she said, she found evidence that he had been in contact with a private investigator, apparently planning to have me arrested for felony theft. The phone records show multiple conversations with someone named Derek Castellano, who operates a private investigation firm that specializes in building criminal cases for corporate clients. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just been stealing money. He had been planning to have me arrested and potentially imprisoned for his crimes. He was willing to destroy my career, my reputation, and my freedom to protect himself from the consequences of his own criminal behavior. Lisa's investigation also revealed the true scope of Marcus' theft. The $87,000 that Walter had initially identified was only part of the total. Marcus had been stealing for nearly 4 years, not 3, and the actual amount approached $130,000 when all the fraudulent transactions were calculated. He got more sophisticated over time, Lisa explained. The early thefts were simple inflated expense reports and duplicate invoices for small amounts. But as his gambling debts increased, he started creating entirely fictitious vendors and forging complex approval chains for larger purchases. Armed with Lisa's professional analysis and Walter's supporting evidence, I called another family meeting. This time, I was prepared with documentation that would expose the full extent of Marcus' deception and criminal behavior. But I was also dreading the moment when my parents would have to confront the reality that their golden child had been willing to destroy his own sister to cover his tracks. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, giving Lisa time to prepare a comprehensive report and allowing me to mentally prepare for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of my life. I knew that presenting this evidence would probably tear my family apart permanently, but I also knew that allowing Marcus' lies to stand would be far more destructive in the long run. As I prepared for the confrontation, I couldn't help thinking about all the warning signs that had been ignored over the years. Marcus' sense of entitlement, his lack of genuine remorse when caught in smaller lies, his willingness to manipulate family members for personal gain. All of these behaviors had been excused or rationalized because he was the golden child who could do no wrong. Now, the family was going to learn that their golden child had become a criminal who was willing to frame his own sister for his crimes. The revelation would force everyone to reevaluate decades of family dynamics and face the uncomfortable truth that their favoritism had helped create a monster. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that normally would have made for a perfect family gathering. Instead, I found myself sitting in my car outside my parents' house, holding Lisa Chen's comprehensive forensic report and trying to summon the courage to walk through the front door. The weight of what I was about to reveal felt crushing, not just the evidence of Marcus' crimes, but the systematic way he had planned to destroy me to save himself. I had asked Lisa to accompany me to provide professional credibility to her findings. She sat in the passenger seat, reviewing her notes one final time, occasionally glancing at me with the kind of compassionate concern that suggested she had seen families torn apart by financial crimes before. "Are you ready for this?" she asked gently. "Once we present this evidence, there's no taking it back. Your family is going to have to confront some very difficult truths." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I would ever be truly ready for what was about to happen. We gathered our materials and walked up the familiar brick walkway that led to the house where I had grown up, where Marcus and I had played together as children, where countless family celebrations had taken place over the years. Dad answered the door, looking like he had aged considerably. In the weeks since Marcus' accusations, his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the uncertain posture of a man whose world was crumbling around him. Mom appeared behind him, her eyes red and swollen from crying, clutching a tissue like a lifeline. Marcus was already seated at the dining room table, his black briefcase positioned prominently in front of him like armor. He had arranged his forged documents in neat stacks, preparing to present his case once again. His confidence seemed unshaken despite the time that had passed since his initial presentation. Grandfather Walter arrived shortly after Lisa and me, carrying a cardboard box filled with additional financial records he had retrieved from the office. At 82, he moved slowly but with determination, his weathered hands steady as he set down his evidence with careful precision. "Before we begin," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional, "I want everyone to know that I've hired Lisa Chen, a certified forensic accountant, to conduct an independent investigation into the financial irregularities affecting Patterson Construction. Her findings will speak for themselves." Marcus leaned forward with a condescending smile. "I think we've already established the facts pretty clearly. Hiring an expensive consultant to muddy the waters seems like an unnecessary complication." Lisa opened her laptop and connected it to a portable projector she had brought for the presentation. The first slide displayed her credentials, certifications, education, professional experience, and a list of high-profile cases she had worked on. The visual impact was immediate and authoritative. "I've analyzed every document presented by both parties," Lisa began. "And I can definitively state that the invoices and financial records Marcus presented as evidence against Audra are sophisticated forgeries." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a side-by-side comparison of legitimate Patterson Construction invoices from 2 years ago versus the fake ones Marcus had created. The differences were subtle but clear, once pointed out: incorrect font styles, inconsistent formatting, and digital signatures that didn't match the company's authentication protocols. "The metadata analysis is even more revealing," Lisa continued, advancing to a screen full of technical data. "These documents, purporting to be from 2 years ago, were actually created last Tuesday and Wednesday using current software that wasn't available during the time period they supposedly represent." Marcus's confident expression began to waver as Lisa systematically demolished his carefully constructed deception. She presented email headers that proved the correspondence between Dad and me had been fabricated, bank records showing that the account receiving payments belonged to a shell company Marcus had created using stolen personal information, and phone logs demonstrating his contact with a private investigator. "Most concerning," Lisa said, clicking to a slide showing phone records, "is evidence that Marcus has been planning this frame-up for approximately 5 months. He has been systematically building false documentation while simultaneously escalating his theft from Patterson Construction." Dad stared at the screen in stunned silence before turning to face Marcus directly. "You were planning to have your sister arrested for crimes you committed?" For the first time since I had known him, Marcus seemed genuinely speechless. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. The foundation of his deception was crumbling so completely that even he couldn't find a way to rationalize or deflect what was being revealed. Mom stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "This is not happening," she said, her voice rising toward hysteria. "My children are not criminals. This is all some kind of horrible misunderstanding that's gotten out of control." Grandfather Walter opened his cardboard box and began removing additional evidence: bank statements, canceled checks, and photographs of Marcus at Atlantic City casinos that had been taken by the private investigator he had hired to document the gambling addiction. "The misunderstanding," Walter said firmly, his voice cutting through Mom's distress, "is that we've been enabling Marcus' destructive behavior for years instead of holding him accountable for his actions. The boy owes $73,000 to underground poker games, and he's been stealing from the family business to pay gambling debts." The revelation about gambling debts added another layer of complexity to an already devastating situation. Marcus finally found his voice, but instead of confession or remorse, he launched into angry deflection. "You've all been against me from the beginning," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "Audra has been the favorite daughter who could do no wrong, while I've been expected to be perfect in every way. You gave her praise for buying rental properties with money that probably came from embezzling our company. But when I try to make executive decisions to improve business operations, I get accused of being a criminal." The accusation was so far from reality that I felt momentarily disoriented. Marcus genuinely seemed to believe that he had been treated unfairly, that his theft was somehow justified by perceived family favoritism that existed only in his imagination. "Marcus," Dad said, his voice breaking with emotion, "you were given every advantage. Harvard education, a BMW, a management position. You didn't earn unlimited financial support. How can you possibly claim you were treated unfairly?" Instead of answering, Marcus stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward. He began pacing around the dining room like a caged animal, his movements becoming increasingly erratic as the walls of his deception collapsed around him. "Fine," he finally exploded. "Maybe I took some money from the company. Maybe I made some financial decisions without getting proper authorization. But I was desperate, and this family never cared enough to notice I was struggling." The partial confession hung in the air like smoke, but it was immediately followed by an even more shocking revelation. "You want to know why I've been struggling?" Marcus's voice cracked with emotion. "You want to know why I felt like an outsider my entire life? It's because I know I'm not really part of this family." The words hit the room like a bomb, and suddenly everyone was staring at Marcus with expressions of confusion and growing dread. "I found my adoption papers when I was 16, he continued, tears now streaming down his face. "Hidden in Mom's jewelry box when I was looking for my birth certificate to get my driver's license. I've spent 12 years knowing I was adopted, knowing I wasn't really a Patterson, watching Audra succeed on her own merit while I was being handed everything out of your guilt for not telling me the truth." The revelation explained so much about Marcus' behavior over the years: his sense of entitlement, his resentment toward me, his desperate need for constant validation and material proof of love. But it also made his crimes feel even more tragic, because his pain had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding about what family really meant. Mom collapsed into her chair, sobbing so hard that her entire body shook. Dad looked like someone had physically struck him, his face pale and his hands trembling as he processed what Marcus had revealed. "Sweetheart," Mom finally managed to say through her tears, "adoption doesn't make you any less our son. You were 6 months old when we brought you home from the hospital. We've loved you as our child for 28 years. "But I'm not your real child," Marcus replied bitterly. "Audra is your biological daughter. She's the one who inherited your work ethic and business sense. I'm just some stranger's baby that you took in and tried to turn into something I was never meant to be." The pain in his voice was genuine and heartbreaking, but it didn't excuse the systematic theft and the attempt to frame me for his crimes. As I watched my brother fall apart in front of our entire family, I realized that his criminal behavior had been driven by years of resentment and self-doubt that none of us had recognized or addressed. The confrontation had revealed far more than just financial crimes. It had exposed decades of family dysfunction, hidden pain, and fundamental misunderstandings about love, belonging, and what it truly meant to be family. The silence that followed Marcus' adoption revelation stretched until it became almost unbearable. Nobody seemed to know how to respond to such a fundamental shift in our family narrative. I found myself staring at my brother, really looking at him for the first time in years, and trying to process the idea that his entire criminal enterprise had been driven by a secret he had carried alone since he was 16 years old. Mom was the first to break the silence, her voice thick with tears and regret. "Marcus, honey, we should have told you about the adoption from the beginning. We were planning to, but you were so young when we first talked about it. And then, as you got older, it just became more and more difficult to find the right moment." Dad nodded in agreement, his own eyes filling with tears. "We were afraid you might feel different about yourself, or that it might change how you saw us as parents. We thought we were protecting you, but clearly we were wrong." Marcus sank back into his chair, the anger seeming to drain out of him as quickly as it had erupted. "I spent 12 years feeling like a fraud. Every family photo, every birthday celebration, every achievement you celebrated, I felt like I was pretending to belong somewhere I didn't really fit." The conversation that followed was unlike anything our family had ever experienced. Years of unspoken assumptions and hidden resentment spilled out as everyone tried to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. But Lisa Chen's presence in the room served as a stark reminder that beneath all the emotional complexity, serious crimes had been committed that couldn't be solved with family therapy alone. "I understand that this is an incredibly difficult situation," Lisa interjected gently, her voice calm and steady. "But we still need to address the financial fraud that's been documented. Marcus has admitted to stealing company funds, and there's evidence of systematic embezzlement totaling over $130,000. Grandfather Walter opened his box of evidence again and pulled out a manila folder that he hadn't shown to anyone before. "There's something else everyone needs to know," he said grimly. "Marcus' adoption wasn't the secret you thought it was." He opened the folder and removed several old documents, hospital records, birth certificates, and legal papers that looked like they had been stored for decades. The papers were yellowed with age and handled with the careful reverence of historical artifacts. "Your parents found out that Marcus knew about his adoption 7 years ago," Walter continued, his gaze fixed on Mom and Dad. "Sharon discovered that the paperwork in her jewelry box had been disturbed, and she realized someone had been looking through it. They hired a private investigator to monitor Marcus' behavior, and he confirmed that their son had discovered the truth about his biological parents." This revelation hit the room like a second explosion. Dad and Mom looked at each other with expressions of shock and dawning realization, as if pieces of a puzzle were suddenly falling into place. "You've known for 7 years that I knew?" Marcus' voice was barely above a whisper. "You've been watching me struggle with this secret while pretending you didn't know I was struggling?" Mom buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with renewed sobs. "We didn't know how to bring it up. Every time we tried to plan a conversation, it felt too big and too complicated. And then you seemed to be doing well in school and with your social life, so we convinced ourselves that maybe you had processed it and moved on." Dad's voice was hollow when he finally spoke. "The truth is, we started giving you more privileges and opportunities after we realized you knew about the adoption, the BMW, the executive position, the financial support. We were trying to prove that you were loved and valued as our son, even though you weren't biologically related." The pattern was becoming clear, and it explained so much about our family dynamics over the past several years. Marcus' sense of entitlement hadn't developed in a vacuum. It had been systematically reinforced by parents who were overcompensating for their guilt about keeping secrets and their fear of losing their adopted son's affection. "You created a monster," Grandfather Walter said bluntly. "Instead of having an honest conversation about adoption and what family really means, you enabled increasingly bad behavior because you felt guilty about circumstances that were never shameful to begin with." I found myself feeling oddly sympathetic to Marcus despite everything he had done. The theft and the attempted frame-up were inexcusable, but I was beginning to understand the emotional foundation that had led to such destructive choices. He had spent 12 years believing he was an outsider, being given charity by people who felt obligated to love him, when the reality was that he had been genuinely loved by parents who were too afraid of difficult conversations to provide the emotional honesty he needed. "This doesn't excuse the embezzlement," I said carefully, trying to balance empathy with accountability. "Marcus, you stole over $100,000 from Dad's business. You forged documents, created false business entities, and tried to frame me for felony theft. Those are serious crimes, regardless of what emotional pain motivated them." Marcus looked directly at me for the first time since his breakdown began. "I know what I did was wrong. I started small, just taking a few hundred here and there to cover gambling losses. But once it started, it felt impossible to stop. Every time, I told myself it would be the last time, but the debts kept growing, and I got in deeper with people who don't accept excuses for late payments." The admission was the closest thing to genuine remorse I had heard from Marcus since this entire crisis began. But Grandfather Walter's expression remained stern and unforgiving. "The gambling addiction explains the motivation," Walter said. "But it doesn't explain why you spent months planning to frame your sister for your crimes. That level of deception requires calculated malice, not just desperation." Marcus was quiet for several long moments before answering. "I was terrified of going to prison. I convinced myself that Audra would be able to prove her innocence eventually, and that she had enough money from her real estate investments to hire good lawyers. I thought maybe she would get probation or community service, while I would get years in prison because of the amount I had stolen." The explanation revealed a level of selfishness and rationalization that was breathtaking in its scope. Marcus had been willing to destroy my career, my reputation, and potentially my freedom because he believed I was better equipped to survive the consequences of his crimes than he was. Lisa Chin had been listening to the family revelations with professional detachment, but she finally interjected with practical concerns. "Regardless of the underlying family dynamics, we need to discuss next steps. Marcus has confessed to felony embezzlement and attempted fraud. This case will need to be reported to law enforcement, and there will likely be criminal charges filed." The reminder that this situation extended far beyond family drama brought everyone back to the immediate reality. Marcus was facing serious prison time. The construction company's reputation could be permanently damaged, and the financial losses might be impossible to recover fully. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Mom looked at Dad with an expression that seemed to ask permission for something. And when he nodded reluctantly, she opened her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. "There's something else you need to know," she said, her voice shaking as she placed the device on the table. "We've known about Marcus' gambling addiction for 2 years. We've known about the debt to underground poker games, and we've known about the escalating theft from the company." She pressed play, and Marcus' voice filled the room through the small speaker. The recording was from a phone conversation between Marcus and someone who was clearly a loan shark or gambling debt collector. Marcus was pleading for more time, promising that he had access to construction company funds, and describing his plan to take care of the auditor problem by shifting blame to someone else in the family. The recording was devastating evidence that Marcus' crimes had been premeditated and that my parents had been aware of his criminal behavior while allowing it to continue. But it also revealed the most shocking truth of all. They had known. He was planning to frame me, and they had done nothing to warn me or protect me from his scheme. The sound of Marcus' voice on the recording confessing to theft and describing his plan to frame me for his crimes created a silence so complete that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. The weight of betrayal was crushing, not just from Marcus, but from parents who had known about his plan to destroy me and had chosen to protect him instead. "You recorded me without my knowledge?" Marcus's voice was barely audible, but the hurt and disbelief were unmistakable. "You've been spying on your own son?" Mom's hands shook as she turned off the recorder. "We hired the private investigator Walter recommended after the gambling debts reached $50,000. We thought if we understood the scope of the problem, we could find a way to help you without involving law enforcement." Dad's voice was hollow as he continued the explanation. "We were trying to gather evidence that we could use to negotiate with your creditors. We thought maybe we could pay off the debts and get you into treatment for the gambling addiction." The revelation that my parents had been conducting surveillance on their own son while enabling his criminal behavior added another layer of dysfunction to an already devastating situation. But what hurt me most was the realization that they had known Marcus was planning to frame me and had chosen not to warn me. "How long did you know he was planning to blame me for the theft?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Mom couldn't meet my eyes when she answered. 3 weeks. The recording is from 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. I repeated, trying to process the magnitude of their betrayal. You knew for 3 weeks that Marcus was planning to have me arrested for felony theft, and you didn't say anything to me about it? Dad finally looked at me directly, his face reflecting shame and regret that seemed genuine, but came far too late. We thought we could convince him to confess and make restitution without anyone getting hurt. We were planning to stage an intervention after the family barbecue. The timing was almost laughably ironic. They had been planning an intervention for the same day that Marcus's theft was accidentally exposed by my casual mention of a real estate investment. Their carefully orchestrated plan to protect everyone had been derailed by a random conversation about rental properties. Grandfather Walter's expression was one of disgusted disappointment. You enabled criminal behavior for months, while allowing an innocent family member to be set up as a scapegoat. That's not protection. That's collaboration. Marcus suddenly stood up, his chair falling backward again as he began pacing frantically around the dining room. The recording had clearly shattered his last hope of maintaining any kind of victim narrative about his situation. "None of this matters now," he said, his voice taking on a manic quality that I had never heard before. "Everyone knows the truth. My life is over. I'm going to prison. I'll never work in construction again, and I'll spend the rest of my life being known as the family criminal who tried to frame his own sister." He walked to the window and stared out at the backyard where this entire crisis had begun just 1 week earlier. When he turned around, his face had taken on an expression of calm resignation that was somehow more frightening than his earlier panic. "I can't live with this," he said quietly. "I can't face prison, and I can't face the shame of what I've done to this family. Maybe it would be better for everyone if I just disappeared." The words sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the October weather. Mom immediately stood up and moved toward Marcus, her maternal instincts overriding everything else that had happened. "Don't say things like that," she said, reaching out to touch his arm. "We're going to get through this as a family. We'll find the money to pay restitution. We'll get you the help you need for the gambling addiction, and we'll face whatever legal consequences come together." Marcus shrugged away from her touch and walked to the kitchen, returning moments later with a prescription pill bottle that he held up for everyone to see. "I've been thinking about this for days," he said, his voice eerily calm. "These are sleeping pills that Dr. Morrison prescribed after I told him I was having anxiety about work. I've been saving them instead of taking them." The threat was clear, and Mom immediately burst into fresh tears while Dad fumbled for his cell phone to call 911. Marcus opened the bottle and poured what appeared to be 20 or 30 pills into his palm, holding them where everyone could see them. "Marcus, don't do this," Dad pleaded, his finger hovering over the emergency call button. "Whatever problems we're facing, we can solve them together. This isn't the answer." But as Marcus raised his hand toward his mouth, I noticed something that made me look more carefully at the pills in his palm. They were white and round, but the size and shape looked familiar. I had been taking vitamin C supplements for months, and the pills Marcus was threatening to swallow looked identical to the ones in my medicine cabinet. "Stop," I said, standing up and walking closer to examine what he was holding. "Those aren't sleeping pills." Marcus froze with his hand halfway to his mouth, his eyes meeting mine with an expression of surprise and growing panic. "Those are vitamin C tablets," I continued, recognizing the specific brand and dosage that I bought in bulk from Costco. "I can see the faint imprint on the side that says Nature's Bounty 1000 milligrams. The entire room seemed to deflate as everyone realized that Marcus' suicide threat was as fake as the documents he had used to frame me for theft. Even his final desperate gambit was built on deception and manipulation. Lisa Chin, who had been observing the family dynamics with professional detachment throughout the evening, finally spoke up with a tone of clinical assessment. This is a classic manipulation tactic used by people with narcissistic personality traits, she said. When all other attempts to control the narrative fail, they resort to threats of self-harm to regain sympathy and avoid accountability. The psychological evaluation was delivered with the same calm professionalism that Lisa had used to present her forensic accounting findings, but it had the effect of stripping away the last vestiges of Marcus' victim narrative. Dad slowly lowered his phone without making the emergency call. Mom stopped crying and stared at Marcus with an expression I had never seen before, disappointment mixed with recognition that her son was not the person she had believed him to be. "Even your suicide attempt is fake," Mom's voice carried a note of incredulous betrayal. "How long have you been manipulating this family with lies and theatrics?" Marcus let the vitamin tablets fall from his hand, the small white pills scattering across the hardwood floor like confetti. His shoulders sagged in defeat as he realized that his final attempt to manipulate the situation had backfired completely. "I wasn't really going to hurt myself," he admitted quietly. "I just wanted everyone to stop being so angry and remember that I'm still part of this family despite what I've done." The admission was the final straw for grandfather Walter, who stood up slowly and fixed Marcus with a stare that carried 8 decades of accumulated wisdom and disappointment. "Boy," he said bluntly, "you've lied about everything else, and now you're lying about wanting to kill yourself. You've stolen from your father, framed your sister for felony crimes, and manipulated your parents' love into enabling criminal behavior. You're not the victim in this story. You're the perpetrator." Walter gathered his evidence files and headed toward the door, pausing only to deliver a final judgment that would haunt Marcus for years to come. "Real family members don't destroy each other to save themselves. What you've done proves you never understood what it meant to be a Patterson, adoption or no adoption." As the door closed behind my grandfather, I realized that the confrontation had finally reached its end. Marcus' elaborate web of lies, manipulation, and criminal behavior had been completely exposed, and there would be no more opportunities for him to shift blame or avoid accountability. The fake suicide attempt had been his last desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his ability to manipulate. But it had only succeeded in revealing the full extent of his willingness to deceive and manipulate the people who loved him most. The aftermath of Marcus' fake suicide attempt marked the beginning of the most difficult period in our family's history, but it also became the foundation for genuine healing and growth. The following Monday morning, Dad called the police to report the embezzlement, armed with all the evidence that Walter and Lisa Chin had compiled. Marcus was arrested at the construction office while he was attempting to delete computer files that contained additional evidence of his fraud. The legal process moved swiftly once the authorities became involved. Marcus' sophisticated forgeries and the attempted frame-up elevated the charges from simple embezzlement to aggravated fraud with intent to obstruct justice. The district attorney's office was particularly interested in the systematic way he had planned to destroy me as part of his cover-up scheme. Marcus' attorney negotiated a plea agreement that resulted in an 18-month sentence in minimum security prison, 3 years of supervised probation, and full restitution of the $137,000 he had stolen. The gambling debts to underground operators were a separate matter that required Dad to take out a second mortgage on the family home to protect Marcus from potential violence. During the 6 months between Marcus' arrest and sentencing, our family entered intensive therapy to address decades of dysfunction that had contributed to the crisis. The sessions with Dr. Rebecca Martinez were painful but necessary, forcing all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about favoritism, enabling behavior, and the difference between love and guilt. Mom struggled the most with accepting responsibility for her role in Marcus' downward spiral. Her maternal instincts had been so focused on protecting him from consequences that she had never allowed him to develop genuine accountability or self-awareness. Dad had similar issues with recognizing how his guilt about the adoption secret had led him to create an environment where Marcus felt entitled to special treatment, regardless of his behavior. I found myself working through complex feelings of anger, betrayal, and unexpected grief for the brother I had thought I knew. The therapy sessions helped me understand that Marcus' adoption status had never mattered to me. He had been my annoying little brother who got more attention than seemed fair, but he had always been family. His perception that he was an outsider had been entirely self-created, based on secrets and assumptions rather than actual family dynamics. The most surprising development during this period was Marcus' gradual transformation in prison. The structured environment and mandatory counseling for gambling addiction forced him to confront his behavior in ways that family pressure had never accomplished. He wrote letters to me and our parents, acknowledging the full scope of his crimes and accepting responsibility without making excuses or seeking sympathy. His first letter to me arrived 4 months into his sentence. "Audra, I know that apologizing doesn't undo the damage I caused or make up for the fear and stress I put you through. I spent months planning to have you arrested for crimes I committed, and there's no explanation that makes that acceptable. I was willing to destroy your life to save myself from consequences I deserved. That's not something a real brother would ever do, and I understand if you never want to speak to me again." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing his recognition of the manipulation tactics he had used throughout his life and his commitment to genuine change rather than just saying whatever people wanted to hear. It was the first communication from Marcus that felt completely honest and free of self-serving rationalization. While Marcus was serving his sentence, I continued building my real estate portfolio with renewed focus and energy. The stress of the criminal investigation had actually motivated me to work harder, and I used the emotional intensity as fuel for professional growth. By the time Marcus was released from prison, I owned 7 rental properties, and I had started a consulting business helping other women learn real estate investment strategies. Dad restructured Patterson Construction with new financial oversight procedures and brought in Walter as an official partner rather than just a silent investor. The company's reputation recovered gradually as clients learned that the family had voluntarily reported the embezzlement and made full restitution without being forced to do so by law enforcement. Marcus' release from prison was handled carefully, with clear boundaries and expectations established in advance. He moved into a halfway house rather than returning to live with our parents, and he found work as a construction laborer with a company that hired people with criminal records. The manual labor was humbling for someone who had expected to inherit an executive position, but it was also therapeutic in forcing him to earn respect through work performance rather than family connections. The first time I saw Marcus after his release was at a family dinner 6 months later. He looked different, thinner, more careful in his movements, and noticeably humble in ways I had never seen before. The arrogant entitlement that had characterized his personality for years had been replaced by genuine remorse and what appeared to be authentic self-awareness. "I know this doesn't fix anything," he said to me privately after dinner, "but I want you to know that I think about what I did to you every day. You worked hard to build something real while I was stealing and lying to maintain a lifestyle I didn't earn. You deserved a brother who supported your success instead of one who tried to destroy it out of jealousy and selfishness." The conversation was awkward but necessary, and it marked the beginning of a gradual rebuilding of our relationship based on honesty rather than shared history. I didn't forgive him immediately. Trust had to be earned through consistent behavior over time, but I was willing to allow the possibility of eventual reconciliation if his changes proved to be genuine and lasting. 2 years later, Marcus had maintained his sobriety from gambling, paid back 60% of his restitution through steady employment, and developed a relationship with Sarah Chin, a social worker who knew about his criminal history from the beginning. Their relationship was built on complete honesty, which was revolutionary for someone who had spent most of his life manipulating people through charm and deception. The most meaningful moment of healing came during grandfather Walter's 85th birthday celebration. Marcus approached me during the party and asked if he could speak to the entire family. With everyone gathered in the same backyard where this crisis had begun 3 years earlier, he delivered a speech that was unlike anything I had ever heard from him. "I want to thank Audra for refusing to enable my destructive behavior, even when it would have been easier to let me get away with manipulating everyone's sympathy," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "I spent years believing that I was the victim of unfair treatment when the reality was that I had been given every advantage and had chosen to waste all of them. Audra succeeded through her own hard work while I was stealing from family and planning to frame her for my crimes. She had every right to hate me forever, but instead, she's given me the opportunity to earn back her trust by becoming someone worthy of being her brother. The speech continued with genuine apologies to our parents for exploiting their love and guilt, recognition of the pain he had caused throughout the family, and a commitment to continuing the personal growth that prison had forced him to begin. It was the first time I had ever heard Marcus take complete responsibility for his actions without making excuses or seeking sympathy. As I listened to him speak, I realized that the golden child who had been handed everything but had earned nothing was gone. In his place was someone who had learned the value of honesty, accountability, and genuine relationships built on mutual respect rather than manipulation. The family that emerged from this crisis was healthier than the one that had existed before it. We had learned to love each other without guilt or enabling, to have difficult conversations without avoiding uncomfortable truths, and to hold each other accountable while still providing support for genuine growth and change. My real estate business continued thriving, and I started mentoring other young women who wanted to build financial independence through property investment. Marcus found fulfillment in construction work that he earned through skill and reliability rather than family connections. Our parents learned to show love through honesty and appropriate boundaries rather than guilt-driven indulgence. The most important lesson we learned was that true family bonds aren't created by blood relationships or maintained through material generosity. Real family connections are built on honesty, accountability, and the willingness to love each other enough to refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when confronting the truth is painful. Marcus' adoption had never made him less of a Patterson. His criminal behavior and willingness to destroy family members to protect himself, that's what had made him unworthy of the family name. But his commitment to genuine change and accountability had gradually earned him the right to be called our brother again. 3 years after that family barbecue that had started with a thrown beer bottle and accusations of theft, we gathered again in the same backyard for Walter's birthday. This time, there were no secrets, no hidden resentments, and no one getting special treatment they hadn't earned. We were finally a real family, built on truth rather than guilt, and held together by love that was strong enough to demand the best from each other. The golden child, who had been given everything but had valued nothing, was gone. In his place was a man who had learned that the most precious things in life, trust, respect, and genuine family bonds, could only be earned through honest effort and maintained through consistent integrity. That transformation had taken criminal charges, prison time, and years of hard work. But it had ultimately saved not just Marcus, but our entire family. As I watched my brother help Walter blow out his birthday candles, I reflected on how much we had all grown through this crisis. Sometimes, the most painful experiences become the foundation for the most meaningful growth. And the family member who almost destroyed us had ultimately become the catalyst for making us stronger than we had ever been before. So, after hearing everything, what do you think? Have you ever faced such deep betrayal from family, and if so, how did you navigate that path towards healing or closure? Or, more generally, how do you think we can break cycles of favoritism and entitlement in families? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to hear your perspective.